Good evening, everybody, and it's wonderful to be here with you for our Research Week. And of course, it's very significant for me today to know that we're talking about wisdom for action, because in a nutshell, really, that's what I'm going to be trying to talk about. I'm looking at science education and STEM education and teacher education, but from a philosophical, critical, feminist kind of perspective, looking at the role of the arts in interrupting the discourse, and in particular looking at the role of a modern university, or might I say a postmodern university, a university now in 2024 in Ireland, and asking what is the purpose of the academic world, what is the purpose of an academic university in Ireland at this particular moment in time, and therefore, I suppose, where I will lead with the slides will be into a looking at what Judith Butler talked about, is what's our responsibility in terms of academic freedom. Because academic freedom has obligation and responsibility tied in with it. So how are we in the university advancing science and science education and STEM education and STEAM education, and how are we doing it in a world that's highly technological and highly scientific? And how are we doing that to make a difference to Irish society, to the democratic assignment that we have, that big difference? So why do I think Wisdom for Action is a great title, in fact, besides interrupting the discourse? And I think it is because we often think in a university that it's more knowledge everybody needs. But we have history that tells us that giving people more and more knowledge hasn't necessarily meant that they were more caring or kind to the world. It means that they still went out and exploited the resources of the world and damaged the world to the extent that we call it a climate change crisis. They had a lot of knowledge. So what kind of was missing there in that space? Is it more knowledge necessarily that everybody needs to make this world heal itself, to save humanity and the planet? Now, obviously, we do need science knowledge, scientific knowledge, we need technological knowledge, we need the knowledge of all the disciplines. But there's some illumination piece going on there for me, because the university is a search for truth, knowledge and beauty. I haven't heard beauty mentioned in quite a while, or aesthetics. Foucault, the French intellectual, reminds us that there are regimes of truth, that maybe your truth isn't exactly the same as my truth, and maybe the truth for a person who's living in an elite lifestyle with lots of safety nets under them, maybe their truth is different from somebody who's homeless or somebody who's in a war-torn zone, and maybe their truth is different. So that seeking of knowledge, truth and beauty crisscrossed between ontology and epistemology and ethics and philosophy and politics, if you crisscross them all together, I think what you get when you do the melting of all of that is you get wisdom. And when you have some kind of a grasp got at wisdom, hopefully you will make the wisdom for action to make a difference to the world you're in, because it isn't knowledge just for its own sake. So as I get into the slides then, I am going to be asking why I'm talking about interrupting the discourse at this moment and how I'm planning to do it. So my why is because we've all taken it as a normalisation of a whole lot of things now in the university. But normalisations happen very rapidly and we seem to lose our memory. And there's a normalisation of evidence-based policy making now, but that was only brought in from the United States in the mid-1990s, from the Gulbenkian report. Evidence-informed practice makes perfect sense. Counterintuitive knowledge would make perfect sense, but evidence-based kind of suggests a supremacy, a dominating discourse that really doesn't allow a lot of illumination for other ways of knowing. So That's where Butler's work on the obligations and the responsibility of the academic world to mind the gap and to manage academic freedom. So what am I talking about? Judith says in her book, in her paper on academic freedom, she says that the state must fund public research, public education systems, but it doesn't necessarily and cannot control the whole thing. And that's what academic freedom means, that there's a gap, and that the university must mind the gap between the state and state agents and itself. It must mind the gap between itself and corporations and industry. It needs to be able to dance with all the players, but it needs to be able to mind the gap. And the real purpose of minding the gap is for the public responsibility of a democratic society. There would be no need to mind the gap if we lived in a totalitarian regime, because there wouldn't be any gap. But in a democratic society, there is a gap, and that gap needs to be minded. And the arts are your tools. You know, inside the university, your toolkit to mind the gap are always the arts. Philosophy, history, all of the arts give you that toolkit to actually mind that gap. So we know that STEM and science education are powerful forces for change in the world, but in relation to saving humanity and the planet and the environment and the new social contract we need for some kind of transformative possibility and human emancipation, well, we need to rethink and reimagine how we do these subjects, how we do this knowledge, how we respect other ways of knowing, how we bring in aesthetics, ethics, politics and all of that in there. It's very interesting. If you go back to the ancient Romans, Aristotle brought it in. Aristotle, in the early days, 2,000 years ago, was talking about not only knowledge and truth and beauty, but the ethics and politics had to be in there. Of course, if you bring in the politics, it becomes very messy, it becomes very awkward. You wonder, where does it stop? Where does it start? But it would be living in the world is where I'd like to be, and kind of living in maybe a bit more of a mess rather than it being so clear. So interrogating some features then of a colonising discourse and looking at that social justice but epistemic justice, looking at the university and saying, how does a university behave itself so that it gives epistemic justice, allows people have the concepts, the ideas, the intellectual tropes, that they can actually debate things in the public forum and that they have the theory to do it. Because I guess, for me anyway, in the second decade of the 21st century, what would it mean to be enslaved in the Western world now? It would mean to be left without theory, without the big ideas, be left without the big concepts. So you have no understanding of why you're doing something. Somebody is asking you to be a Deliveroo and go off and do this. And that's sometimes how I see the modern approach or post-postmodern approach to almost teaching. There's a kind of a Deliveroo approach. Somebody thinks it up, locks the slides and hands it to somebody else and asks them to go off and do a delivery. So I want to make the familiar strange. I hope I tickle your imagination, that I get you thinking. I'm not looking to land on a spot where I have the big hero answer, but I do want to open this up, because critical and feminist perspectives allow us to use theory and the arts to sap power and to rethink about what we're doing and ask us to stop and think. So throughout the presentation, I'm using these as lenses. I'm looking at what are the ways and understandings of the purposes of education, and then what's actually happening at the moment in science and STEM education, and what part of it is, I suppose, offering great hope, as well as maybe the dark times that we're in. And then what conclusions can I suggest? So UNESCO, I cling to the UNESCO report that was written in 2020 that actually asks us to have a new social contract for education, right in the middle of COVID and right through COVID, and many countries have joined up, and it's inviting us to reimagine a new social contract for education. And we've got to get on and do it fairly quickly, because with our climate change and our immigration issues and war in the world and all of that, we're seeing, well, we don't want the knowledge and wisdom and truth and beauty in the university to be making no difference to the world and the society we're living in, and not to be enriching Irish society to be bold and imaginative and grasp some new thinking at this time. So who's perceived as having authority either in the academy or in the public world? Who are the spaces? Are we foregrounding intersectionality between gender and race and disability and all of that, social class? Are we doing that just thinking of it siloed for an individual? Is that what we mean by inclusion? Or are we thinking of it for the collective of society? So we bring more people in, we have a more literate, a scientific literate population, so that we can make really good decisions together. So it comes to the framing of the problems. So that's what I do in research. I suppose I enjoy the critical and philosophical and feminist critique of the framing of policies. Because you often find when you look with a microscope and a telescope and an infrared radiation approach with your eyes, you will actually, and through the literature, you will find fierce big loopholes in what's been said. And again, two things that I'd mention here is that I often like the analogy of comparing the theory of education with the journey and the history of theoretical physics. Because if you look at the journey of theoretical physics, it started off with classical physics, a kind of linear rational. You know, the apple fell from the tree, hit Newton on the head, and Newton came up with his linear laws of motion, and he became a very important person, and no one dared to ever say that there might be another way of doing the world or understanding how the world was constructed. So all through the 17th and 18th century and 19th century until the turn there around 1920s, we got quantum theory. And quantum theory blew classical physics out of the water. And what it said was, you know, wave-particle duality. You can be a particle and a wave and a probability all at the same time. There's Schrodinger's cats now, there's games of chance, there's relativity, Einstein's involved, they're all in there. There's indeterminacy. All of a sudden, we've gone from this linear rational view and so on. So, you know, paradoxes are introduced, living with paradoxes, chance, all of these things. Now, I don't see any of that theory in the theory of education. I see education being presented as, in a way, as almost like as if you are playing with behaviours. You've, you know, the old iceberg model, the guy with all the stuff underneath, and he's doing all his, you know, you're connecting wires to people and you're checking how their behaviours are, and you're measuring, and you have social psychology giving you all the data on these behaviour managements. So much so that I've even heard recently people going to do studies on wiring people up to see are they sweating when they're teaching. Do you know? So a very linear rational view that I think needs to be debunked. It's the modernity view, it needs debunking. But we've got to open a new conversation and think of looking at it differently. The irreducibility of human dignity means we should stop atomising everything about the human. We need a holistic view more than the sum of the parts. The university, as set up at the moment, probably doesn't even allow that more than the sum of the parts, because that would include knowledge, truth, beauty, and all the illumination in between, being and becoming and everything, about not only being, becoming, and being an individual and working in an institution and living a life as a worker, etc., but for the greater good of humanity and the collective of Irish society, as well as that bigger world picture. So what happened in the 1980s that most of these marvellous people who have actually really taken this argument to pieces And I think it was the Berlin Wall collapsed. It was almost like the end of communism. And all of a sudden, the 1990s and the 2000s rewrote education as being about the individual, the institution, and the markets. And you'd be hard-pressed now in any policy, anywhere, to see anything about society or the collective good of our society. You'll be very hard-pressed to find that written in any policy today. So we have normalised something that has actually left us not being able, as I'd say, with my quantum physics hat on me, to live in the paradox of being able to be an individual and caring for that individual, and in the paradox of actually working with the collective and the critical consciousness of the collective together in a holistic way. So those different understandings then of education came. Kane talked about that what works perspective. That's the dominant. All you need to do is find out how you can rejig somebody so that they work in a certain way. I still use an old-fashioned watch, but I kind of explain this human capital theory idea as it's like you get everybody to wear a smartwatch, and then you co-opt them into this information technology, so you see them as bits and bytes. You use 0 and 1, you use coding, and you get them into that space. So all you have to do is measure and manage and name your outcomes and have them all predetermined. Now, how that could be called education in the first instance is a question I leave you. I would call it maybe instruction, excellent instruction, or maybe excellent coaching, or maybe what was called in the old days training, but I wouldn't call that education. The other one is to see education as more relational. Now we're in problems because relation involves dialogue, it involves listening, empathy, feedback, hearing as well as listening. It involves a genuine conversation. It isn't really about just reporting to those above you in a hierarchy where you keep reporting up and there's no word coming down. It isn't talking into an echo chamber. So Buber in the 1930s and all those other people that wrote in the 1930s, and you know the world then, he did a philosophy of relationship that talked about I, it, and I, thou. So he said education relations and relations of love in our families and in education relations, in education used by Nell Noddings and others, is that it must have the I, thou piece in it. So if it's going to be all I, it can be functional, it can be online, it can be measured, you can be wired up, and you can be a commodity. Now, we all have I, it pieces. We're all human with needs, and we all have I, it pieces. So they're a both and they're not an either or. But my point here is that for education to be emancipatory, according to Freire and lots of others, it needs to be relational. And that puts an onus great onus on the teacher and the educator. It couldn't certainly all be done online, but there'd be no problem with blended learning. But it certainly couldn't be done online. And what you would end up doing is if you did everything online and you had no interaction with your students that was on a personal presence basis, your students would start suffering mental health issues. And we have people writing about that at the moment. And we've shown how the statistics for mental health issues, and so we've started bringing in programs of well-being and everything to ameliorate almost the problem we set up in the first instance. So am I doing okay? Am I tickling your imaginations here? Good. So Miranda Fricker talks about this epistemic justice, that purpose of the university, and talks, as I said, about epistemic goods that we need people to have so that they can share and explain and understand where they're coming from. And the testimonial epistemic injustice is done when the speaker is not valued as an authority, when somebody else is seen as the authority and the speaker is not for some kind of prejudicial reason. Or a social group themselves might not be seen in that area, so you would have a hermeneutical epistemic injustice. So those are kind of connected to what I'm saying in terms of wisdom for action. So mapping then the change, if I'm getting my microscope or telescopes or my infrared radiation or whatever else I'm doing to try and look through these policies, is there a way I can get through it where I can understand what's actually happening and look at what are the moves that are being done in education policy at the moment that would give us an indication that it's becoming and staying a colonising discourse? In other words, it's reproduction of privilege. Those who are already advantaged will do very well. Those who are already disadvantaged will continue to do very poorly. So how does the system, how does the machine work in that way? So Mooney has a lovely paper, and he said that there's only a few chess moves needed to make sure that happens. And the two chess moves that he talks about are, one is technicisation. So you take education, the way I've explained it, being set up on philosophy, sociology, all of the different areas that I have it coming from, history, culture, the whole lot, and you say, not at all. Geraldine, you don't need that. You don't need to be worrying about all that old philosophical stuff. That's gone. What you do is you technicise it into the nth degree, atomise it. So talk about evidence-based practice. Is there evidence or isn't there not? Can I wire you up and see how you're doing in behavioural terms? How are you going with your smartwatch? Are you doing your steps? Are you not doing your steps? Are you in or are you out? And have you got your outcomes? And if not, could you trot along and do a little bit of catch up yourself on another over, so we'll put you over to some other piece of technology that you might be able to play that and listen to it. The other piece, he said, is you depoliticise education entirely. You take politics in every shape or form out of it. Now what have you done? You've taken power out, you've taken privilege out. You're not going to be asking who benefits. You're not going to be asking who benefits, and you're living inside a hierarchical organisation. And you're going to have somebody telling you to do democratic relations inside a hierarchical organisation, and you're not going to be able to even call that a discursive struggle or an ethical struggle, which of course it would be if it was named properly, because one would want to do a democratic relations with people and lower power inside institutions. So Mooney did this across, if you do this across general education, you would find all of the policies are looking for us to make a smart student, remake the institution as a scientific entrepreneurial model that has nothing to do with metaphysics or philosophy, that doesn't need that at all, and remake it with a bit of numerical objectification, which is really lovely for, I suppose, artificial intelligence, coding, and we all love that stuff, but if that's all we're doing, we'll have to worry. So the smart student, S for self-regulating, motivated, adaptive, responsible, tech-savvy. There's your smart. That's what you're doing. That's the whole purpose of education in the university. If you read all of the policies in teacher education, in the science education literature and in the teacher education literature, there isn't a word said about that person being caring, altruistic, having a critical consciousness for their society, making a difference to the planet, or actually working with people in genuine conversation or opening a genuine conversation to do something anyways differently. Now, how we expect to solve the climate action and get a safe planet and enjoy stargazing out there, which I love, how are we going to do that with this smart, competitive individual? I don't know. Now, there is a bit of interaction needed. This smart person will need to be in tutorials with others because they'll be allowed what's called interaction. But that will be functional. That will be it. I'll be going in there to get my thing from them and they'll get their thing from me. That won't have an I-thou piece to it. That'll be interactional. It'll be it. Now, go into the science literature then. big research on the science literature and let's see what's happening there. Well, the modernist view is what you do in science education is you ignore education. You get rid of that word because you say if you leave the education people at that, they'll be pulling it into moral dilemmas and they'll be talking aesthetics, truth and beauty and everything. So what you do is you introduce a new thing called nature of science and you try and make every student in the country a mini scientist. So you pull away ethical dilemmas and you depoliticise it and you technicise it. So the young person in school wears their white coat and does their scientific inquiry and does their evidence-based learning, and that's all wonderful, but you don't give much play to the other stuff. Bang called it a bit of a dogmatic image of thought. He's having a go at it. That how can you argue with logic? If somebody gives you streams of logic and they give you streams of logic, it's very hard to negotiate with that. That's kind of black and white kind of debating. There's no heart or soul in it. And then Hodson calls it a bit of a dehumanising discourse. If we're teaching now, we are one of the biggest providers of science teacher and STEM teacher education in Ireland in post-primary schools. And we actually teach young people in schools that are aged 12 to 15 and aged 15 to 18. And so the question is, are we going to continue teaching them in the same way? Is it going to be a focus only on one type of knowledge and one way of knowing, or can we play paradoxes and incoherence and indeterminacy, and are we able to live in the mess of working with seeing the child and the young person and recognising them and teaching them the wonders of science and technology? But here's, I suppose, for me to come and uplift you. There's a wonderful movement that has broken out in the last 4 or 5 years in science education literature. We're going to have a conference on the 11th of July with one of the keynote presenters here, Professor Sarah Talbert from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. She's coming to us. And there's a huge, huge flutter of papers and books wanting to do this differently, wanting to reimagining science education, and they're saying it's in the Anthropocene. I'm not going to get carried up with you on a debate about that. I think what I like about that is, well, it's saying it's in a moment where we're realising how much damage we've done to the planet as we're living on it, that what we've done since the Industrial Revolution, more knowledge hasn't meant more care for the environment. So all those discourses of science education in the literature are all saying 2017, 18, 19, 14, 23, all of the papers, they're all saying the same idea, which is let's have a critical appraisal of what we're doing in education. Let's relook at it and say, could we live with the ethical dilemmas of understanding that we want to have really good scientific and technological knowledge, but we also need to respect other ways of knowing, situated knowledge, ethics, and we can't keep the power and the politics out of the debate, because we do want to lower the power and we do want to be able to do the right thing for a whole range of young people that are coming through now, and for their chance for the next generation to be living in a world of artificial intelligence. It's here to stay. How about working with it? And being creative and imaginative and finding our way to work with it and working with all the science and technology, which is wonderful and exciting and can make a difference to our lives. So my conclusions are as follows. Technicisation has limited the language of education and turned it into a narrow discourse of learning. It is a strong technical and a strong moral discourse. And the moral discourse that runs beside it is codes of conduct, rules and regulations. And if any university in Ireland or across Europe or the Western world fears a problem is coming towards it, guess what it will do? Make more rules, codes, rules, regs, principles, more moral discourse. So you have this highly competitive, hyper-masculine sort of a discourse of dominance, numerical objectification. Progression is based on bang, bang, bang. Predetermined outcomes, independence, adaptive, resilient. There's no talk of you actually being an interdependent human being and dependent throughout our lifetime. Men and women and all of us, we're all dependent on others throughout our lifetime, and we're interdependent, as well as wanting to be. Of course we want to be independent. Thinkers inside a university wanting to be able to be self-determined people who can think for ourselves. Oh, for sure. Depoliticisation, well, no acknowledgement of power relations and anything, no struggle so. So how do you do democracy in a hierarchical elite institution? No, it doesn't cross anybody's mind. Whereas we know that knowledge, power and ideology are inextricably linked, and the evidence is all before our eyes, and it's all over the literature. You haven't been reading if you don't think those are connected. So we're in more of a monological kind of a situation than a dialogical. And there's non-recognition then of systemic barriers. Because if there, as Margaret Thatcher said, if there's no such thing as society, well, there's no such thing then as systemic barriers that stops anybody progressing in life. Because we ain't going there. Because we're only talking about the individual, the institution and the markets. I found that recently when I went to look for a research application, funding application. Education was positioned in the part of the IRC funding where it was called individual, institution and markets. There wasn't a word society anywhere near it. So all I'm doing in my work and working with others across the world is staying with the trouble of all of this. I like the biologist Donna Haraway, who recommends us to not rush into a corner with a kind of a dominance and run off again with the primacy of one knowledge or one way of being. Could we just turn to one another, and could we engage in a new kind of dialogue? Could we reimagine how we do science education and never pretend it's stripped of purpose and power and politics and values and ethics and ambition? And could we actually say that good intentions as an educator are never enough? Because Bourdieu, the Frenchman, put it very nicely when he said, our good intentions are never enough because otherwise we're doing symbolic violence. If I come towards you as an education researcher and I tell you that I am neutral and I'm objective and I've nothing to do, I've no skin in the game at all, and I'm going to examine those people over there in the area of education, and I'm going to do a research study and pretend that I actually have no interest in education, where education is in fact changing the gaze of another in its particular direction and for a purpose. And is changing the gaze of another not only in a particular direction but for multiple purposes and often contradictory. And those contradictory purposes are, for example, becoming a person internally, your soul world, your spiritual development, whatever you deem that to be, the work on your being, your human being and your human becoming, as well as wanting to live well in the world and all of the other things. So there's nothing innocent about it, and teachers are not coming to the students to do nothing to them. We do have intentions. We do want to turn people's gazes in a certain direction, so we cannot say it's stripped of all of that. So we are continuing this conversation. On the 11th of June, Tuesday, we are holding a National Humanising the Discourse conference in UL in Epistem. And on the 10th of July, Wednesday, we are going to be looking at reimagining science education in the Anthropocene with our keynote from New Zealand. So I'll just leave you with some of the references and just say to you that if you want to get in touch with me, if you want a copy of these slides, if you want, if I have tickled your imagination sufficiently that you'd like to hear any more of this or the paper that comes out of this work, I'd be delighted if you connect with me. Thank you so much for listening.